that into June, we are going to be catching up with people who were there. We have been hearing stories about what it was really like when Argentina invaded the Falklands 40 years ago. Now, this is a really interesting story. It involves a Royal Navy helicopter commando. His name is Harry Benson, and back in April 1982, he was 21, one of the youngest pilots, fresh out of training, to find himself embroiled in the conflict. And he's here now. Morning.
Hi, good morning.
Nice to have you here. And I mean, 21 is one of those ages. I had no responsibility when I was 21. To think that you were involved in a conflict that was making headlines all around the world. I mean, can you remember how you found out that the Argentines had invaded and what happened next?
Yeah, it is extraordinary. To think that I was 21 flying a 7-ton helicopter into battle, an amazing responsibility. But I was still a 21-year-old, so unstrapped me from a helicopter and I was still an idiot, like many other 21-year-olds, but we were just very, very well trained. We were well-trained idiots. I remember when the news first came through, virtually the universal question amongst almost all servicemen at the time was, where on earth are the Falklands? Is it somewhere off Scotland? And we all had to go and sort of search maps to find out exactly where it was. And only then did we find out that it was 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic.
So how quickly were you scrambled there, and what were you told about what you would be doing?
Well, the fleet set off about 3 days after the decision was made to go, after the invasion took place. But I was originally assigned to what was called garrison squadron. So, when the idea was that the war would be fought by some of the military, and then there would be other military would be needed to take over once it was all over. So we were originally sent down as garrison squadron. So in fact, I ended up in Northern Ireland, where we were serving at the time, for a few weeks, and then we were scrambled and sent down. So I actually set off at the beginning of May. We arrived at the beginning of June, which was for the last 10 days of the war, which was plenty of time for excitement and action. But so we arrived late, and then we stayed 3 months after the end of the Falklands War, which was an awful long time in a very cold, wet and windy climate.
So what were you doing in that last crucial 10 days?
Well, I arrived on a ship called RFA Engadine, which is an auxiliary ship, with my colleagues from 847 Squadron, who were then based at Yeovilton at the other end of Somerset to where I am now. And we arrived on land, and our job was to move stuff and people from A to B. So my first mission in the Falklands, for example, was to go to a grassy airstrip called Goose Green, which had just been captured from the Argentinians by the Paras. And there'd been a big battle there. And my job was to move a Gurkha brigade forwards, which we did. And so I was flying my machine at about average sort of 20, 30 feet above the ground, which is pretty low, over rolling countryside. If you think of Dartmoor in February, you've probably got the right sort of idea. And then as we got closer to the front line, these burning ships appeared, the famous Galahad and Tristram, which had been hit a day or two earlier. That was a pretty gruesome sight and a grim reminder that we were not just in a beautiful rural setting, but we were also in the middle of a war zone. And then we dropped off our troops and flew back and went and got the next batch. And that was the sort of thing that we did. And a couple of days later, we were actually right on the front line, going in, rescuing people from some of the hills that had been captured just around Port Stanley, which was the capital. And we came under very heavy artillery fire while we were picking up casualties, because the Argentines could actually see us, not just hear us, over the side of it, over the edge of the hill. So we were that close to the front line. That was quite exciting.
Well, it's funny you use the word exciting, and I've spoken to many military professionals through the years that I've been doing this job, and the phrase that comes up all the time is, we were just doing our job. But it's one thing knowing what your job is, it's absolutely another when you are there in the thick of it. I mean, were you scared? Were you frightened?
I had one. Funnily enough, on the way down, when we had our first air raid warning on board the ship as we were approaching the Falklands, and it turned out to be an Argentine airliner that had come to have a look at us. But we were at action stations on the ship, and that was the most frightening I ever experienced. Because I'd realised that we were basically stuck in a tin can, and I said such to my an older colleague of mine, who must have been all of 30, so a grand old man at the time, and he basically said, "Look, Harry, come on, sunshine, you're an officer. There are younger people around here. You're supposed to set an example." And it sort of kind of knocked me out of my mindset and made me realise, oh yeah, actually, fear is fine, but actually, my prime job is to set an example as and the fact that I was a pilot, I was also an officer, and so when we were actually flying into action, I never really let the fear get through to me, because I knew that I had to do my job, and I knew I also had to set an example, and that lesson really carried me through. And I heard a veteran talking about courage and setting example the other day. And the expression he came up with was, he said, everyone knows that fear is contagious, and it is. When people are scared, then everyone gets scared. But courage is also contagious as well. And I think that's what this guy taught me when he said, look, you've got to overcome your fear, you've got to set an example. But actually what you're doing is you're showing courage, and it has a contagious effect on other people. Very powerful. And so even as a 21-year-old, I was able to do that. And then we all were, quite honestly. So flying into battle, being shot at, lots of artillery fire coming down. Actually, the thing we were most scared of was not the artillery fire, which we couldn't do anything about, but it was about these enemy aircraft called Pucaras, who could come and attack us and fly slowly, and therefore sort of a helicopter was very much a sitting target. And so that's what we were most nervous of. And they did fly while we were there. We flew a few times, but I never actually saw any, mercifully, although some of my colleagues did.
You mentioned that you were there for the last 10 days. What did you find out when the Argentines finally surrendered? Was there some sort of big announcement over the radio? And then what were you doing for the next few weeks that you were there, presumably looking after the people who lived on the island?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm slightly ashamed of this, but because we arrived late, and the action was very exciting and slightly nerve-wracking, going in and picking people up and whatever. But because it had been over a fairly short space of time, only a matter of days, I almost felt like I hadn't had enough. And I remember flying up towards the front line with a load of stuff on board in the back of the helicopter, and hearing over the radio white flags flying over Stanley. And I remember feeling a small sense of disappointment that I sort of hadn't really had enough. And people who'd been there from the start were all obviously utterly relieved and were fed up with the whole thing. But it was a pretty awful thing to think. But that's the reality of it, was that I hadn't quite had enough. Anyway, after the war, actually, I got more than my fair share of enough. I mean, as well as being shot at during the last few days. After the war, we were moving, and we moved up to Port Stanley, or opposite Port Stanley, and we were there to do hearts and minds stuff for the local population, so to move stuff around. There was an awful lot of mess that needed clearing up. We needed to clear minefields, we needed to move bodies from some of the trenches, so it was all pretty grim stuff. And there were accidents as well, and there was a particularly appalling accident a couple of weeks afterwards, which still lives with me to this day. Anyway, I mean, I'm not even going to go into it. It was so awful to describe, but it was a missile that accidentally went off into some troops, and it was just terrible. And my squadron had to pick up the pieces, and I picked up one of the guys the next day, and I remember picking him up off the hospital ship, and the downdraft from my rotors blew off his blanket, and he had no limbs. They'd been chopped off, and I retched. And I remember that really lives with me to this day, actually, how utterly awful it was. So there were some fairly harrowing moments, and of course the weather was just grim down there. It was the middle of winter in the South Atlantic, and the weather could change from the beautiful sunny day that we've got here in Somerset at the moment to being this violent snow shower. And I had an engine failure once in a snow shower because so much snow built up in my engine intake that it just literally flamed out the engine. So that was quite exciting as well.
I love the use of the word exciting. I'm sitting here gripped by fear as you're kind
Yeah.
of living it through the eyes of a 21-year-old who is doing what you've got to do. It's fascinating that you said after the event, and particularly the harrowing story of seeing a friend of yours. You've written up your story. The book is called SCRAM. When you got back from the conflict, and your family presumably were all over you saying, "Oh, thank God you're here." Were you able to sort of take stock of it? And then when you wrote the book, looking back, how do you feel about what you went through?
I think the extraordinary thing is that what I've experienced is what you hear again and again and again from veterans of all wars. And I've heard it from World War I veterans when they were still alive. I've heard it from World War II veterans, Korea War veterans, Vietnam veterans. I hear it from Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Nobody talks. And you come back and everyone asks you, and it's all very interesting, and people are sort of temporarily interested in it. But after a while, you just think, I really don't want to talk about this anymore. I've had enough of it, because although it was, as young men, we were doing our job, but we were doing, and I'm going to use the word exciting again, we were doing an exciting job of blasting around at 100 miles an hour at 20 feet above the ground. And that was all very exciting, but it was also doing things that human beings shouldn't do to one another. And that does slightly get you. And so after a while of coming back, after literally a matter of weeks, I just didn't want to talk about it to anybody after that, because I realized that people's attention span is pretty short. And it lost interest as a subject. And I sort of let it go to the back of my brain for many years. And about 20 years later, we were sitting in a pub in Whitehall for the 20th anniversary march past in the Mall, and a bunch of us colleagues got together, and it was a very emotional moment, actually, seeing people after a long period of time. But sitting in a pub gave us license to talk, and as helicopter pilots, we realized very quickly that we'd all assumed that we'd all done the same sort of thing. We'd all shifted stuff from A to B, or we'd all got shot at, or we'd done this, that, and the other. And what I didn't realize was how many amazing stories there were that I simply hadn't heard. I hadn't heard about the incredible crashes of two helicopters up on the glacier on top of South Georgia. I hadn't heard about some of the rescues that even my best mates had done from burning ships. I hadn't heard of going head-to-head with Argentine A4 jets. I hadn't heard of a colleague who'd gone head-to-head with a Pucara. All sorts of things like that. Absolutely amazing stories that came out that we were hearing for the first time. And I realized I just had this idea, this has to be told as a story. And even though I was the junior Joe, or one of the junior Joes, I just thought, I'd written a couple of books on another subject, and I thought it's time to write this story. So I did, and I wrote this book called SCRAM, which came out 10 years ago. And I've just actually asked my youngest son, who's a young 19-year-old actor, and he's absolutely wonderful. He's narrated the book, so it's out on Audible now, and his voice is the 19-year-old, which is the same age as I was when I joined the Navy. And I think he brings a real freshness to the story. And I mean, even if I may say so, it's a cracking good story. And it really tells the story of the entire Falklands War as seen through the lens of our eyes as helicopter pilots in the Falklands.
How amazing that he is nearly the same age as you were when you were doing it. What does he make of the story about what his old man did?
Well, it's very interesting because I gave all my kids. I've got several kids, and he's the youngest. And I gave all my kids copies of the book when it came out 10 years ago. So he was obviously only very young. He was 9 at the time. And he'd never actually read it. And he said it was extraordinary, actually, going through it. He said he'd heard some of the stories. He'd heard me tell some of the stories along the way, but he hadn't heard quite how much we got up to. And also, I think it was quite nice to be appreciated that we were actually really good at what we did. We were extremely well trained and whatever. So I think it's been a really real bonding experience between me and Johnny, who narrated it, and it's been really great for our relationship. And he now knows exactly what I got up to in the war and what we did. I mean, it's become almost a forgotten war. I mean, I know we're talking about it on the 40th anniversary, but it's funny how few people actually think about it or know anything about it, and yet, for us it was a big deal. And it reminds me, interestingly, of when we were at Yeovilton, when I was first flying down there in the early 80s. We used to celebrate something called Taranto Night, which was a World War II thing where the Fleet Air Arm sunk the Italian Navy in Taranto in Italy. And we used to have these old buffers come in and into the mess dinner, and we'd applaud them and think good thoughts about them. And now we're the old buffers now. And we're going back to a dinner in a couple of weeks' time at Yeovilton, actually. And I don't know what the young pilots will think about us old duffers. But anyway, it'll be great. It's great being in amongst with the young blood. So it's been a real bonding experience with my son.
Harry, listen, it has been so lovely spending some time with you today. Thank you for sharing some of the stories, and we can certainly read more about them. SCRAM is the name of the book. His 19-year-old son, Johnny, has narrated the audio version. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.